stand in the courtyard of the Umayyad mosque in Damascus this morning, and you are standing on a site that has been sacred ground for roughly 3,000 years. An Aramean temple stood here, then a Roman temple to Jupiter, then a Byzantine church, then one of the most magnificent mosques ever built. Each civilization remade this place in its own image, and not one of them could make it unimportant. That is the mystery at the heart of this city. Empires rose around Damascus and fell around Damascus. Assyria, Persia, Rome, the caliphates, the Ottomans. Every one of them lost its throne. The city is still here, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. And the human story of its oasis reaches back roughly 11,000 years to some of the earliest farming communities known to archaeology. This is the entire history of Damascus, and it begins with something very simple: a river that refused to let the desert win. Chapter 1. The Oasis that Refused the Desert. Imagine you are walking east out of the mountains of Lebanon. Sometime in the deep past, behind you are cedar forests and snow. Ahead of you, stretching to the horizon, is one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, the Syrian desert, hundreds of miles of rock and dust where almost nothing grows and almost nothing survives. And then, right at the edge of that desert, right at the exact point where the green world ends and the dead world begins, you see something that should not exist. Orchards, miles of them, apricot trees and walnut trees and poplars, canals of running water flashing in the sun, fields of grain at the border of a wasteland. Travelers who crossed the desert from the east and arrived at this site wrote about it. Again and again over the centuries, the way people write about miracles, and it is not hard to understand why. After days of emptiness, the land suddenly erupts into life. Remember those apricot trees. By the way, remember the sound of that running water. Both of them will follow us through this entire story, all the way to its final minutes. The miracle has a name, the Barada River. The Barada is not a great river. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the key to everything that follows. It is not the Nile. It is not the Euphrates. It is a short, cold mountain stream, born from springs in the anti-Lebanon range. And in a straight line it runs barely 50 miles before the desert drinks it dry. By the standards of the rivers that built other great cities, it is almost nothing. But look at what it does with the distance it has. The Barada comes down out of a mountain gorge and hits the plain. And instead of wandering off in one channel, it fans out. It splits into branches, and for thousands of years human beings have split it further, digging canals that carry its water across the plain in every direction. The result is a vast irrigated garden on the edge of the desert, a green island roughly the size of a large modern city. Known for most of recorded history as the Ghouta, Greek geographers were so impressed by what this modest stream accomplished that they called it the Golden River. The Bible mentions it too. In the Book of Kings, a Syrian general named Naaman boasts that the rivers of Damascus are better than all the waters of Israel. He was biased. He was also, from a farmer's point of view, not entirely wrong. Now ask the question that this entire story depends on: who would come to live in a place like this? The answer is almost everyone who ever saw it. The archaeology of the Damascus basin tells a remarkable story. On the plain near the city, excavations at ancient settlement mounds, places with names like Tel Aswad and Tel Ramad, have uncovered villages of farmers dating back roughly 9,000 to 10,000 years before the present. These were some of the earliest farming communities anywhere on Earth. The people who lived in them lived during one of the earliest great transitions to farming. They grew early forms of wheat. They kept some of the first domesticated animals. They built houses of mud and timber and buried their dead beneath their floors. We can imagine them watching the same mountain sunsets that people in Damascus watch tonight. Though what they believed as they watched, no one can tell us. Here is where the storyteller has to slow down, because you have probably heard the famous claim, Damascus, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Is it true? The careful answer is that Damascus is one of a very small number of cities that can seriously compete for that title, and nobody can prove the matter either way. Jericho makes the same claim. So does Byblos on the Lebanese coast. So does Aleppo. Damascus's great rival to the north. There are two real problems. The first is the word continuously. Proving unbroken habitation through every century would require digging up the heart of the old city. And the heart of the old city is covered by the old city, which is full of people, which is rather the point. The second is the difference between the oasis and the city. Those Stone Age farming villages stood in the Damascus basin, in the wider oasis. Not necessarily on the exact ground of the later city. The United Nations Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in its formal description, dates the founding of Damascus itself to the 3rd millennium before Christ, roughly 5,000 years ago, while recognizing the region's far older roots. So let us say it the clear way, and then never cheat on it for the rest of this film. Human beings have been living and farming in the Damascus oasis since the Stone Age, roughly 11,000 years. The city that grew up within that oasis is among the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. With roughly 5,000 years of documented urban history and a long tradition of continuous habitation, whether or not it holds the world title on a technicality, Damascus belongs to the tiny club of places where the human story has simply never stopped. And the reason it never stopped is not just the water. It is where the water is. Spread a map of the Middle East on a table and put your finger on Damascus. Now look at what surrounds it. To the west, over one mountain range, the Mediterranean coast and its ports. To the south, the road to Egypt, the wealthiest land of the ancient world. To the east, across the desert, Mesopotamia, the land of Babylon and Assyria. To the north, Anatolia and the routes toward Europe. Damascus sits at the meeting point of all of them, the last reliable water before the desert crossing. The first green field after it. For a merchant leading a caravan, that fact was not poetry. It was survival. You did not cross the Syrian desert casually. You crossed it from water to water, and Damascus was the water. Caravans had other routes. North through Aleppo, or south through the desert cities, and Damascus never held a monopoly. But countless camel trains moving between the Mediterranean world and the interior had powerful reasons to pass through this oasis. and for thousands of years they did. The city that grew here rarely had to chase trade. Trade had every reason to come to it. We saw this pattern in our stories of other great cities. Paris existed because of a river crossing that could not be made irrelevant. Damascus exists because of a watered crossroads that could not be made irrelevant. Again and again in this story, armies will burn or break this city, and people will walk back and rebuild it. Because the reason for the city is still there. The water still flows. The roads still meet. Above the oasis, watching over all of it, stands Mount Cassion, the bare rocky ridge that forms the city's northern wall. The mountain is wrapped in legends. Local tradition places the story of Cain and Abel in a cave on its slopes, and generations of Damascenes have climbed it at dusk to watch their city light up below. The legends are legends, not history, and we will treat them that way, but they tell you something real. People have lived beside this mountain for so long that they have had time to fill it with stories older than most nations. Thousands of years after the first farmers, an American traveler stood looking at this same city and felt the weight of all that time. Mark Twain passed through in the 1860s, and in his travel book, The Innocents Abroad, he described Damascus as a city that had watched empires rise and fall, a city that measured its life not in years but in ages, one that had seen everything around it grow old and die and had simply gone on. That is a paraphrase of his argument, not his exact wording. But the point survives the translation. Twain looked at Damascus and saw the thing this whole film is about. Because here is the truth the Oasis teaches, and it is the spine of everything that follows. Damascus was rarely the strongest city of its age. It would be conquered again and again by powers far greater than itself. But conquerors need what everyone needs. They need water, food, and roads. And so, time after time, the powers that took Damascus ended up keeping it, feeding it, and building on top of it until the day their empire died and the city welcomed the next one. The farmers by their canals could not have known any of this. They were simply living in the best spot they had ever found, eating apricots in summer, listening to the water run, but far to the south, in the valley of the Nile, scribes were about to do something that changes everything for a historian. They were about to write this city's name down, and once your name is written, history has begun. Chapter 2. The name in the oldest letters. The first time Damascus clearly steps into written history. It steps in on a list of conquered places. That detail is worth pausing on, because it sets the pattern for almost everything that follows. Damascus does not enter the record as a conqueror. It enters the record as a prize. The year is around 1450 before Christ. The most powerful man on earth is the pharaoh Thutmose III, a ruler so successful in war that modern historians have sometimes called him the Napoleon of Egypt. He marches his armies north out of the Nile Valley, into the lands of Canaan and Syria, fighting a great battle at a place called Megiddo, and afterward on the walls of the temple of Karnak. His scribes carve lists of the cities that now bow to Egypt. On those lists, among dozens of names, appears a place the Egyptians wrote in a form scholars read as Ta-Mazi, Most experts accept this as the earliest secure appearance of Damascus in writing, though reading ancient place names is a science with error bars. And we should say so. Think about what that means. When the name of this city was first carved in stone, the city was already old. The farmers of the Oasis had been working their canals for thousands of years before any Egyptian scribe picked up a chisel. Writing did not create Damascus. Writing simply caught up with it. A century later, the record gets better, and it gets personal. In the 1880s, an Egyptian woman digging for fertilizer at a site called Amarna uncovered a buried archive of clay tablets. They turned out to be the diplomatic correspondence of the pharaohs. Letters exchanged with kings and governors across the Middle East around 1350 before Christ. Scholars call them the Amarna letters, and they are astonishing to read because they sound so familiar. Local rulers flatter the pharaoh. They beg for soldiers. They accuse their neighbors of treachery. They complain that nobody answers their messages. And there, in the correspondence, is Damascus, spelled Dimashq, a city caught between great powers. Its ruler maneuvering for survival in a world where Egypt pushed from the south and rival empires pushed from the north. Over 3,000 years ago, this city was already doing the thing it would do for the rest of its history, sitting at the crossroads, watched by empires on every side, and finding a way to matter. Then, around 1200 before Christ, the world those letters describe fell apart. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the great murder mysteries of the ancient world. Within a couple of generations, nearly every major power in the eastern Mediterranean crumbled. Cities burned. Trade routes died. Writing itself disappeared in some regions. The causes are still argued about: drought, famine, invasion, internal revolt. Probably several of these at once. What matters for our story is what the collapse made room for. Into the wreckage came a people called the Arameans. The Arameans were not empire builders from some distant capital. They were herders and tribespeople of the Syrian steppe, people who had always lived at the edges of the settled world. When the old powers fell, they moved into the towns and made them their own. And sometime in the early Iron Age, an Aramean dynasty took control of the Damascus oasis and built something new there. A kingdom, Aram Damascus. This is the moment Damascus stops being a name on other people's lists and becomes the main character of its own story. For roughly 2 centuries, Aram Damascus was a genuine regional power, and we know about it from 2 very different kinds of sources that, remarkably, argue with each other. One source is the Hebrew Bible, where the kings of Damascus appear again and again as the northern rival of ancient Israel. Sometimes enemy, sometimes ally, always dangerous. Kings with names like Ben-Hadad and Hazael march through those pages at the head of armies. The other source is archaeology. Inscriptions carved by the Damascene kings themselves and by their enemies. And here the story produces one of its most electric artifacts. In 1993, excavators at Tel Dan in northern Israel uncovered fragments of a stone monument, written in Aramaic, in which a king boasts of defeating his southern enemies. The author is not named on the surviving fragments. and scholars most often identify him as Hazael, king of Damascus, or a ruler of his line, celebrating victory over Israel and over what the inscription calls the House of David. That phrase made the stone world famous, because it is generally considered the earliest reference to King David's dynasty outside the Bible. Think about that. One of the most important physical clues about biblical Israel that archaeologists have ever found appears to have been written for a king of Damascus. Bragging, Hazael himself is worth a moment. The biblical account describes him as a court official who killed his sick king and took the throne. And Assyrian records sneer at him as the son of a nobody. Yet this usurper built the strongest kingdom his city had yet known, dominating his neighbors and defying the greatest army on earth. When the Assyrian Empire came against Damascus, Hazael lost his orchards and paid tribute. But he kept his walls, and he kept his throne. The son of a nobody died an old man, still king. But the deepest legacy of Aram Damascus was not military at all. It was the language, Aramaic. The tongue of these desert herders turned kings, spread across the entire Middle East. It was practical to write, carried by traders along every road, and eventually adopted by empires as a language of administration. For centuries, across much of the ancient Near East, Aramaic played something like the role a global language plays in our world, the tongue strangers used when their own languages failed them. It was the language Jesus of Nazareth spoke at home, and in a few mountain communities near Damascus, descendant forms of Aramaic, changed by time as all living languages change, are still spoken today. There are people alive right now whose mother tongue descends from the speech of Hazael's kingdom. An empire of soldiers had failed to come out of Damascus. An empire of words succeeded beyond anything a king could imagine. The kingdom itself, though, was living on borrowed time. Far to the east, in the valley of the Tigris, a war machine unlike anything the world had yet seen was grinding toward the Mediterranean. The Assyrians were coming back, and this time they were not interested in tribute. They were interested in ownership. Chapter 3. Empires Passing Through. In the year 732 before Christ, the independent kingdom of Damascus died, and for most of the next 6 centuries, the city would be ruled as a province of someone else's empire, its taxes set in foreign capitals, its fate decided by kings who might never see it. Hold on to that fact, because this chapter covers those 6 centuries, and it is really the story of a question. What happens to a city that keeps losing? The killer of the kingdom was Assyria, and the Assyrians earned their reputation. Their empire, based in northern Mesopotamia, had turned warfare into a science, and their own royal inscriptions boast of flayed rebels and piled skulls, not because the kings were ashamed, but because they wanted the news to travel. Terror was policy, and the policy was advertised. In 732, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III captured Damascus, executed its last king, and deported much of its population to distant lands, a punishment the Assyrians used deliberately to break conquered peoples. By every rule of the ancient world, that should have been the end. Cities died from far less, and yet within a few generations, Damascus appears in Assyrian records again, functioning, farming, trading, now as the seat of an Assyrian province. The deportations had emptied houses, and the oasis had filled them again, because the water still flowed and the roads still met. The reason for the city had survived the death of the city's kingdom. This became the script, and history ran it on repeat. Assyria itself collapsed within little more than a century, brought down by its own rebellious subjects. And its capital Nineveh was destroyed so thoroughly that its very location was eventually forgotten by much of the wider world. Damascus passed to the next owner, Babylon, the empire of Nebuchadnezzar. The king remembered for destroying Jerusalem and marching its people into exile. Babylon's own glory lasted less than a century. Then came the Persians, and with the Persians, something genuinely interesting happens. The conqueror changes character. The Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 500s before Christ, was the largest the world had yet seen, stretching from the borders of India to the edge of Greece. We should not paint it as gentle, because no ancient empire was gentle, and Persia crushed rebellions as hard as anyone. But compared with Assyria's heavily advertised terror, Persian rule more often preserved local temples, locale elites, and local customs. Provided the tribute kept flowing and the loyalty held, exiles were allowed home. Subject peoples kept their gods, and the empire's working language of administration, the language a Persian governor in Damascus used to write to a Persian court 1,000 miles away, was not Persian. It was Aramaic, the language of Damascus. Sit with that irony for a second. The city had lost its kingdom, its independence, and for a time its people, yet its language had quietly conquered the conquerors. When a Persian clerk sealed a document anywhere from Egypt to Afghanistan, the odds were good. He sealed it in the tongue that had grown up along the Barada River. Damascus, the state, was dead. Damascus, the idea, was running the paperwork of the largest empire on earth. Now come down from the map for a moment, because 2 centuries of provincial peace are easy to say and hard to feel. Imagine a morning in Persian Damascus, sometime in the 400s before Christ. We are imagining, and we will say so, but every detail comes from what historians know of the age. A caravan from Babylon is unloading in the outer market. A tax clerk is reading a customs list aloud in Aramaic. A farmer's cart rolls in from the Ghouta, stacked with apricots and pomegranates. The Persian governor's men collect their percentage and bother no one who pays. It is not freedom. Nobody in that market votes for anything. But it is order. And after Assyria and Babylon, order feels almost like love. The Greek soldier and writer Xenophon marched through Syria around the year 401 before Christ with an army of Greek mercenaries, and his memoir of that expedition describes the abundance of these lands under Persian rule. Damascus, in his day, was a provincial hub on the great royal roads, well-watered, well-fed, and politically silent. For a city that had known Assyrian siege towers, boredom was a kind of luxury. Then, in 333 before Christ, the boredom ended forever, because a young Macedonian king shattered the Persian world. His name was Alexander, and at the Battle of Issus, up near the coast northwest of Damascus, he broke the army of the Persian king Darius III so completely that Darius fled the field, leaving even his family behind. And here Damascus makes a brief, vivid, slightly embarrassing appearance in one of history's most famous stories. Before the battle, Darius had sent his war treasury and much of his royal household to Damascus for safekeeping. Because Damascus was the safe place, the strong, walled place, the place you sent things you could not afford to lose. After the victory, Alexander sent a general south to collect it all. Ancient historians describe the haul with wide eyes: gold, silver, royal women, noble hostages, the portable wealth of an empire, handed over more or less without a fight. Damascus had backed the losing side by simply standing still, and it surrendered the way it had learned to surrender. Quickly, sensibly, and with the canals still running, Alexander went on to conquer an empire stretching from Greece and Egypt to the Indus Valley, and then died in Babylon at 32. Leaving no capable heir, his generals immediately began fighting over the corpse of his conquests. And for the next several decades, Syria was the rope in their tug-of-war. Damascus changed hands between rival Greek dynasties, the Ptolemies ruling from Egypt and the Seleucids ruling from Syria, so many times that historians need charts to track it. But something important was happening beneath the political noise. Greek was arriving, Greek soldiers, Greek merchants, Greek city planning, Greek ideas. The Seleucid kings founded and rebuilt cities across Syria on the Greek model, with straight streets, marketplaces, theaters, and temples to Greek gods. Damascus, ancient as it was, began to absorb this new world, adding a Greek layer on top of its Aramean and Persian layers, the way the Oasis soil adds silt. By the end of this period, a man walking through Damascus might hear Aramaic in the market, read Greek on the coins, and pray at a temple whose god had 3 different names depending on who was asking. The storm god Hadad of the Arameans was becoming, in Greek mouths, a face of Zeus. Hold that thought, because the ground where Hadad was worshipped is the same sacred ground from the opening of this film. And its story is just getting started. The city was becoming something the ancient world had few words for. Not Greek, not Persian, not simply Aramean. Layered, composite, Damascene. 6 centuries of losing, and the city had somehow gained an identity. To the west, meanwhile, a republic of farmers and soldiers on the Italian peninsula was beginning to look east with interest. The Romans were coming, and they would give Damascus 2 things it had rarely enjoyed at the same time: peace that lasted for centuries, and a street so famous it is mentioned in the Bible by name. Chapter 4. The Street Called Straight. Every city has an address that outlives it. Rome has the Forum. New York has Broadway. Damascus has a street so old that its name appears in the Bible. And here is the astonishing part. You can still walk it today. The Book of Acts calls it the street called Straight. Damascenes call it by names that mean the same thing. And it still runs east to west across the old city. A mile of shops and stone. following the line that Greek and Roman engineers laid down more than 2,000 years ago, Mark Twain, visiting in the 1860s, could not resist teasing it. In The Innocents Abroad, he joked that the street was straighter than a corkscrew, but not as straight as a rainbow, and that the scripture writers showed their care by calling it the street which is called straight, without personally promising that it was. The joke lands because the truth underneath it is extraordinary. When Rome took this city, Rome did not replace it. Rome organized it. And the organizing lines have never been erased. Roman power arrived in 64 before Christ, when the general Pompey the Great swept through Syria, ended the dying Greek dynasties with a shrug, and folded the region into the Roman world. 4. Damascus. The change of management eventually delivered the things centuries of empires had never delivered. Peace with a long shelf life. Roman Syria became one of the richest provinces of the empire, and Damascus settled into generations of something it had rarely known: safety. But early Roman Damascus had a strange double life, and it involves a people most viewers have met without realizing it: the Nabateans. If you have seen pictures of Petra, the rose-colored city carved into the cliffs of Jordan, you know their work. The Nabateans were Arab merchants who had grown fabulously rich, controlling the caravan routes that carried frankincense and spice out of Arabia, and their commercial reach extended north to Damascus, where at times they held real influence and, for a period, real power. The New Testament preserves a small trace of this arrangement. Paul mentions in his second letter to the Corinthians that when he escaped Damascus, the city was being watched by the governor under King Aretas, a Nabatean ruler, a city inside Rome's world, partly minded by the merchant kings of Petra. That was Damascus in the 1st century. Which brings us to the most famous thing that ever happened on the road to this city. Around the year 36, give or take a few years, a young man named Saul of Tarsus was traveling from Jerusalem to Damascus. Saul was a Jew of the Greek-speaking world, and like many such men, he also carried a Roman name, Paul, a detail that matters in a moment. By his own account in his letters, he was a fierce persecutor of a small new movement, the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, and he was going to Damascus in connection with suppressing it, which tells you the movement had already reached this city within a few years of the crucifixion. What happened on that road is described 3 times in the book of Acts. A light from heaven, a voice asking, "Saul, why do you persecute me?" Days of blindness, and then, in a house on the street called Straight, a nervous Damascene believer named Ananias laying hands on the persecutor, who regained his sight and was baptized. Here is what the sources can and cannot establish. Those dramatic details, the light, the blindness, Ananias, and the street, come principally from Acts, which was written decades later, and historians read it accordingly. But Paul's own surviving letters, which even skeptical scholars date to within about 25 years of the events, confirm the core in his own hand. He had persecuted the movement. Something near Damascus turned him completely around. He was in this city, he escaped it, and he spent the rest of his life as one of the most consequential missionaries in Christian history. He did not change his name on the road. Whatever tradition says, Saul and Paul were the same man's two names all along, and the record simply shifts to the Roman one as his story moves out into the Roman world. Either way, the geography is permanent. This city is stitched into the origin story of the largest religion on earth. The phrase "a road to Damascus" moment lives in the English language to this day, meaning a total reversal of belief. Billions of people have heard of this city's road without knowing anything else about the city. Paul's exit was less dignified than his entrance. With the gates watched, his supporters lowered him from the city wall in a basket. By night, he tells the story against himself in his own letters, which is one reason historians believe it. The most influential theologian of early Christianity left Damascus the way a teenager sneaks out of a bedroom window. History does not record his comments on the experience. While all this was happening, the city around it was being rebuilt in Roman confidence, and its centerpiece was the largest sacred building project Damascus had ever seen, the Temple of Jupiter. Remember the opening of this film, the sacred site with civilizations layered upon it. This is the second great layer, rising in real time. For centuries the Arameans had worshipped their storm god Hadad on this spot. The Romans, who made a habit of merging local gods with their own, identified Hadad with Jupiter and raised over the old sanctuary one of the great temples of the Roman East, a vast walled compound with towering gateways and colonnades. Its outer courtyards so large that whole blocks of the modern city sit within its footprint. Shoppers in the Al-Hamidiyya market today walk out of the covered bazaar and pass directly beneath the surviving Roman columns of its western gate, most of them without breaking stride. The temple gate became a market entrance. Very little in Damascus is ever thrown away. The city's Roman centuries rolled on, prosperous and mostly quiet. Then, as the empire itself turned Christian after the emperor Constantine, the layers shifted again. In the late 300s, under the emperor Theodosius, the great temple compound was converted, and a church rose within it, dedicated to John the Baptist. A later tradition, which we can report but not verify, held that the saint's head was enshrined inside. Jupiter's house became John's house. The storm god's courtyard filled with hymns. The third layer had been laid. By the 500s, Damascus was a thoroughly Christian Roman city, governed now from Constantinople. The eastern capital we call Byzantine. Aramaic still filled its markets. Greek filled its churches. It had outlived Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Alexander, and the pagan gods of Rome itself, but its next two visitors would arrive almost together, and between them they would change everything. One was the oldest enemy of all, Persia, back for one final war. The other was a faith nobody in Damascus had ever heard of, carried out of the deserts of Arabia, and it was coming to stay. Chapter 5. The year everything changed. Great turning points rarely announce themselves, but this one almost did. In the early 600s, anyone standing on Mount Cassiyun and looking out at the world could see that something enormous was ending. What nobody could have guessed was what would replace it. Start with the exhaustion. For a generation, the two superpowers of the age, Byzantine Rome and Persia, had been locked in what some historians call the last great war of antiquity. And it was a war of mutual ruin. In 613 and 614, the Persians took Damascus and then Jerusalem, carrying off Christianity's most sacred relic, the true cross. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius fought back with campaigns so desperate and so brilliant that he eventually broke Persia completely and recovered the cross. On paper, Byzantium won. In reality, both empires finished the war the way two boxers finish 15 rounds: upright, swaying, and defenseless. Their treasuries were empty. Their armies were bled white, and the frontier tribes they had paid for generations to guard the desert edge had been cut loose to save money. Nobody in Constantinople or Persia was watching Arabia. Arabia, as it turned out, was watching them. In the year 632, in the oasis town of Medina, the Prophet Muhammad died, leaving behind something the Arabian Peninsula had never produced: unity. The scattered, feuding tribes had been bound into a single community with a single faith, Islam, and an energy that startled everyone it touched. Within 2 years of the Prophet's death, Arab Muslim armies were probing north into Syria. They were not large armies. They were fast, motivated. At home in the desert, the empires treated as a wall, and led by commanders of remarkable ability, one commander above all. His name was Khalid ibn al-Walid, and military historians have studied him ever since. The early Islamic sources credit him with a desert march that became legendary, cutting across waterless country to appear in Syria where no Byzantine planner thought an army could be. And those same sources say he never lost a battle in his life. The sources were written by the winners, and we should remember that, but even discounting for admiration, the results on the map speak for themselves. In 634, Muslim forces converged on the richest prize in southern Syria, Damascus. What happened next matters enormously, and it matters mostly because of what did not happen. There was a siege. It lasted months. The early Arabic historians, writing generations later and not always agreeing with each other, preserve a story that one commander's troops forced their way in at one gate, while at another gate the city's leaders were negotiating a peaceful surrender. And the two claims afterward had to be reconciled. No eyewitness account survives, and the details are beyond recovery. But the tradition that does survive is consistent about the outcome, and the fullest early version comes from the historian al-Baladuri, writing about 2 centuries after the event. He records the terms of surrender as they were remembered. The people of Damascus were promised security for their lives, their property, and their churches. Their city wall would not be torn down. No soldiers would be quartered in their homes. In exchange, they would pay a tax and accept the new authority. Read those terms with the eyes of the ancient world, and the missing items are deafening. The surviving traditions describe no general massacre, no burning of the city, no mass enslavement of its people. We cannot audit a 7th century siege from here, and we should not pretend to, but everything that followed supports the picture, because the canals kept running, the markets reopened, and the Christian majority of Damascus went back to work under rulers who, at this stage, were a small military minority encamped at the edges of a city that vastly outnumbered them. 2 years later, in 636, the Emperor Heraclius sent a great army to take Syria back, and it met the Muslim forces at the Yarmouk River, southeast of the Sea of Galilee, over several days of battle. In choking dust, the Byzantine army was not merely defeated but destroyed. Later sources give Heraclius a line of farewell as he withdrew, a long goodbye to Syria. And whether or not he ever said the words, the sentiment was accurate. Byzantine rule in Syria, the direct continuation of the Roman rule that began with Pompey, had lasted 700 years. It never returned. Now put yourself inside the walls of Damascus in the years after the conquest, because this is the part most tellings skip, and it is the most interesting part. Almost nothing visible changed. The new rulers did not force conversion. Islamic law, as it developed, granted Christians and Jews a protected but legally subordinate status, taxed and separate. And the practical reality in early Damascus was a city that remained overwhelmingly Christian for generations, praying in its churches, speaking Aramaic and Greek, administered largely by the same local officials, because the conquerors were soldiers, not accountants, and they needed the people who knew how the canals and the tax rolls worked. For decades, the government's paperwork in Syria was still kept in Greek, by Christian civil servants, and one Christian Damascene family rose so high in the new state that we will meet its most famous son in the next chapter. And in the middle of the city, at the great church of John the Baptist, the one standing inside the old temple of Jupiter, something remarkable is said to have happened. The Muslims needed a place to pray. Later, Muslim historians describe an arrangement in which the two faiths shared the vast sacred compound for decades, Christians worshipping in their church, Muslims praying in a section of the enormous courtyard, both communities entering through the same ancient temple precinct that had been holy ground since the days of Hadad. Modern scholars debate the details, because our accounts are late and the archaeology under a living mosque cannot simply be dug up, so hold it carefully. The tradition of the shared sanctuary may be idealized, but it is the tradition the city chose to remember, and even as memory, it tells you something. When Damascus changed civilizations, the story it kept about itself was not a story of conquest and demolition. It was a story of two faiths under one ancient roof, working it out. Absorb, accommodate, continue. The city had been practicing for 3,000 years, because the newcomers, whether they knew it or not, had just made a decision with world historical consequences, struck by the wealth of the Oasis, needing a base for their wars against Byzantium. Their leaders had settled on Damascus as the center of power in Syria. Within a single generation, that choice would explode beyond anything anyone imagined. The city of the Barada River was about to become the capital of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Chapter 6. Capital of the World. For one extraordinary century, roads from 3 continents led toward decisions made in Damascus. If you stood on the street called Straight in the early 700s, you were standing in the ruling city of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Africa and Spain to the borders of India and China. Orders written in Damascus were obeyed in Cordoba and in Central Asia in the same season. Measured against everything before it, This was among the very largest empires the world had yet seen. Comparable to Rome at its height, and by many reckonings larger in sheer territory. And it was all run from the Oasis at the edge of the desert. The city that had spent 6 centuries as somebody's province. How that happened is a story of one shrewd man and one family. And it begins in the wreckage of a civil war. After the Prophet Muhammad's death, leadership of the Muslim community passed through a series of caliphs, and within a generation the community was torn by conflict over who had the right to rule. That conflict, whose wounds shape the Islamic world to this day, ended its first phase in the year 661 with power in the hands of the governor of Syria, a man named Muawiyah, of the Umayyad family of Mecca. Muawiyah had governed Syria for 20 years. He knew its cities, its tribes, and its armies, and they knew him. And when he became caliph, he did the thing that changed everything. He did not move to Mecca or Medina, the holy cities of Arabia. He stayed home. Damascus, the ancient crossroads, was now the capital of the caliphate. Muawiyah is one of the most interesting rulers of the entire early Middle Ages, and we glimpse his style through the sayings later historians attributed to him. The most famous is the image of the single hair between himself and the people. He is supposed to have said, "There stretched one hair, and when they pulled, he loosened, and when they loosened, he pulled, and so the hair never broke." The quotation is a later tradition, not a recording, but it preserved what contemporaries clearly believed about the man: flexible, patient, and always holding the hair. That was the Umayyad state in one sentence. Under Muawiyah and his successors, the armies of the caliphate rolled outward at a pace that still bewilders historians. Westward across North Africa, then across the strait into Spain in 711, eastward through Persia into Central Asia and to the edge of India. Twice their forces besieged Constantinople itself, and the wealth of all of it flowed back to Syria, into a Damascus that was being transformed from a provincial town into an imperial stage. Yet here is what a visitor to early Umayyad Damascus would have found strange. And what makes this empire so fascinating? It ran, to a remarkable degree. On the machinery of the world it had conquered. The tax records were kept in Greek. The civil service was full of Christians. Among the most powerful administrative families of the early caliphate was a Christian Damascene family, the family of Sarjun, whose members had served the Byzantines before serving the caliphs. And that family produced one of the most influential Christian thinkers of the entire Middle Ages, a man remembered as John of Damascus. Tradition places John himself in government service in his youth, a detail written down long afterward. But what is certain is where he ended and what he made. He withdrew to a monastery and wrote theology so foundational that churches east and west still study it today. One of the great fathers of Christian thought was formed in the milieu of the caliph's Damascus. That fact alone tells you what kind of city this was. Around the year 690, a new generation of caliphs began giving the empire an identity of its own. The Caliph Abd al-Malik switched the administration from Greek to Arabic and issued a new coinage that carried words instead of portraits. And then his son, al-Walid, decided that the capital of the world needed a building worthy of the title, which brings us back, at last, to the sacred site from the beginning of this film. The shared compound arrangement, however it had physically worked, was ended by Al-Walid around the year 705. The church of John the Baptist was taken down, and the later Muslim historians, who are our main sources, record that the Christian community received compensation and guarantees for other churches in the city. In its place, over the following decade, rose the great mosque of Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque, and it was unlike anything built before it. The scale of the effort became legendary. Later, historians claimed the project consumed years of the entire empire's tax revenue, and while nobody can audit that figure, the building itself argues for it. Craftsmen were gathered from across the Mediterranean world, including, the sources say, mosaic artists trained in the Byzantine manner, and what they created still exists. Walls and arcades sheathed in golden mosaics showing a paradise of rivers, orchards, and palaces. A shimmering green and gold dream city wrapped around a real courtyard. Some scholars see in those mosaics an image of paradise. Others, an idealized portrait of the Umayyad world itself. And perhaps for the men who made it, there was no difference. Look closely at those mosaics today, and you will see rivers running through fruit trees. The artists of the Caliph, decorating the greatest building on earth, filled it with the two oldest treasures of Damascus, orchards and running water, and the layers were honored. Inside the vast prayer hall, a shrine of John the Baptist stands to this day, maintained and revered by the Muslims who pray around it, on the ground where his church once stood, inside the walls of Jupiter's temple, above the sanctuary of Hadad, the storm god. 30 centuries of sacred history, and you can stand on all of it at once. When Al-Walid opened his mosque, later chroniclers gave him a boast, that he had built a wonder of the world. For once in the history of royal boasting, the boast held. 13 centuries later, it remains one of the most beautiful buildings human beings have ever made. The city around the mosque lived a golden age. Poets competed at court. The caravan wealth of 3 continents moved through its markets. The Umayyad princes, raised between desert and oasis, built hunting palaces out in the Syrian steppe whose ruins still stand, decorated with paintings and baths, the country houses of the masters of the world. It lasted 90 years. The Umayyad Empire had grown faster than almost any state in history, and its seams were pulling. Many non-Arab converts to Islam resented social and fiscal inequalities that continued to privilege sections of the Arab military elite. The partisans of the Prophet's family had never accepted Umayyad rule, and their grief had a name and a date: Karbala, in the year 680, where the Prophet's grandson Hussein was killed by Umayyad forces, an event mourned by millions to this day. In the 740s, revolution caught fire in the eastern provinces under black banners, and in 750, at a river in Mesopotamia called the Zab, the Umayyad army was destroyed by the forces of a rival family, the Abbasids. What followed was one of the most ruthless, dynastic exterminations on record. The victorious Abbasids hunted the Umayyad princes down. One infamous account, preserved by later historians, describes dozens of surviving Umayyads invited to a banquet of reconciliation and killed at the table. The tombs of the caliphs in Damascus were desecrated. The family that had ruled from the Atlantic to India was erased in a season, except for one young man. His name was Abd al-Rahman, a grandson of a caliph, about 20 years old. The traditions of his escape read like a novel, and they were written down by admirers. So we allow for polish. The Abbasid horsemen ran him down at a village on the Euphrates, and he escaped by swimming the river while, the story says, his younger brother turned back and was killed on the bank. He then crossed the entire breadth of North Africa as a fugitive. Roughly 5 years and 3,000 miles of hiding. And in 756 he surfaced in Spain, at the far western end of the empire his family had built, and took power there. The dynasty of Damascus was reborn in Cordoba, where it would rule for nearly 3 centuries and build one of the most brilliant civilizations of medieval Europe. If you have ever seen the great mosque of Cordoba, you have seen homesickness in stone. Its founder even named his country estate after one his family had owned in the Syrian steppe. And a famous tradition says he planted it with a palm tree from home, and wrote poetry to the palm, telling it that they were both strangers in the West. Damascus itself woke from the golden age to a colder morning. The new Abbasid rulers wanted nothing to do with the city of the dynasty they had slaughtered. They packed up the government of the world and moved it east, to a brand new capital rising on the Tigris River. It was called Baghdad, and for Damascus, 4 long, humbling centuries were about to begin. Chapter 7. The Long Shadow of Baghdad. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls on a city the morning after power leaves it. Vienna knew it after the Habsburgs. Paris knew a version of it when its king moved to Versailles. Damascus learned it in 750, and then had 4 centuries to study the lesson. The facts were brutal in their simplicity. The caliphs were gone to Baghdad. The tax revenue of 3 continents no longer flowed through the markets of Damascus. The poets followed the money. The ambitious followed the poets. And the city that had commanded the world became, once again, what it had been under Assyria and Persia and Rome, a province, a very old, very proud province, with one of the largest mosques on earth and a long memory. Worse, the new masters distrusted it. Damascus had been the Umayyad city, and it stayed loyal to that memory in ways that repeatedly ended badly. In the early Abbasid decades, the city and its region rose in revolt more than once, and each rising was crushed. At one point, the sources record, stretches of the city walls were pulled down in punishment. The ancient defense that even the conquerors of 634 had promised to spare. Legends grew in this soil for generations. Travelers reported Damascene whispers of a redeemer from the old family who would return one day from the west, where the last prince had vanished. He never came. The city aged into its resentment, and then, slowly, grew out of it. Because here is what the political story misses, and by now you know to look underneath the political story. The canals still ran. The Ghouta orchards still bore fruit. The pilgrim road to Mecca still needed a great northern gathering city, and the caravans still watered at the Barada. Damascus, out of power, was still Damascus at the crossroads. The city compounded quietly, like interest. Its craftsmen in these centuries built the reputations that would carry the city's name around the world. Blades and fine steelwork, inlaid metal, carved wood, woven cloth so associated with the city that Europe would eventually call a whole family of patterned fabric damask, a word whose exact path into European languages is tangled, as trade words always are, but whose root is the city's own name. We will meet the steel legend properly, and honestly, in a later chapter, the point stands here. When a city cannot export power, it exports excellence. Damascus was becoming a brand centuries before anyone invented the word. Meanwhile, the empire that had demoted it began to weaken at the center, and the weakness set off a scramble that made Syria some of the most contested ground on earth. Here the history becomes, frankly, a blur of dynasties, and no viewer should be asked to memorize it. Governors of Egypt broke away and took Syria with them. Baghdad clawed it back and lost it again. Tribal raiders sacked the city at one low point in the 900s. For about 2 centuries, Damascus changed masters the way other cities change mayors, and the names of most of those masters are remembered today only by specialists. 2 of the newcomers, though, mattered enormously, and they arrived from opposite directions. From the west, in 969, came the Fatimids, a revolutionary movement that had conquered Egypt, founded Cairo, and claimed leadership of the entire Islamic world in opposition to Baghdad. They were Shia, champions of the party of the Prophet's family, while Damascus by now was firmly Sunni in its majority loyalties, and the marriage was never happy. The chronicles of Fatimid Damascus read like a case file of urban misery, riots, factional street militias, governors expelled or killed, and in 1069, in one of those episodes of chaos, catastrophe touched the city's heart. Fire reached the Umayyad mosque, and the building that Al-Walid's craftsmen had sheathed in gold was gravely damaged. Its treasures lost, its mosaics scoured. The mosque survived, as it survives everything in this story. But the wound was a sign of the times. The city of the world had become a city fought over by everyone and cared for by no one. Relief, when it came from the steppes of Central Asia, which is one of history's favorite jokes. In the mid-1000s, a new power took the east. The Seljuk Turks, nomad cavalry lately converted to Sunni Islam, seized Baghdad in 1055, proclaimed themselves protectors of the Caliph, and swept west. By 1076, their commanders held Damascus. The first Turkish decades were as rough as anything before them, with princes fighting over Syrian cities like heirs over an estate. But the Turks brought something Syria had not seen in a long time, a serious military class that intended to stay, and a program. Walk with me through Damascus in the early 1100s, and you can see the program in the streets. We are imagining the walk, but every stop on it is documented. Between the Great Mosque and the markets, New buildings are going up with a shape the city will never stop building afterward. The madrasa, the endowed college of law and religion, with lecture halls and student lodgings and a salary for the professor, funded forever by the rents of shops and orchards signed over in trust. One college, then 5, eventually dozens, packed into the lanes around the Umayyad mosque, their doorways carved like jewelry. Students are arriving from Persia and Spain and everywhere between. Booksellers cluster near the mosque gates. In the courtyard of a college, a law professor is dictating, and 40 pens are scratching down every word. Damascus had lost the world of power. It was quietly winning the world of learning. One of those students deserves a face. Around the year 1100, a boy from a scholarly Damascus family was memorizing texts in those colleges. His name was Ibn Asakir, and he would grow up to write, in 80 volumes, the most massive history of Damascus ever attempted. A biographical encyclopedia of seemingly every notable person who had ever touched his city. Ask why a demoted provincial city produces the largest city history in medieval literature, and you have understood Damascus in this era perfectly. It had lost the world, so it wrote itself. Memory was the one empire nobody could move to Baghdad. So picture the city at the close of this chapter: scarred walls, burned and patched mosque, a bruised pride 4 centuries deep, but also full colleges, full markets, full orchards, and a population hardened by chaos and hungry for one thing above all others: a ruler who would make the chaos stop. That ruler was coming. But before him came something nobody in Damascus had planned for at all. In 1095, in a field in France, the Pope stood up before a crowd and preached a holy war. Within 4 years, an army of Frankish knights had marched across the known world and taken Jerusalem. And the coast of Syria began to fill with something new under the sun: Crusader kingdoms, to educated Damascenes. These invaders came from the far, poor, backward edge of the world, and the chroniclers of the city wrote about them accordingly, with a mixture of horror and disdain. The disdain would not last. Damascus was about to spend a century as the front line of a war of civilizations. And out of that century would come the forgotten architect of its revival, and the man who inherited his mission. Chapter 8. Saladin's City. In the summer of 1148, the people of Damascus climbed their walls and saw something no living Damascene had ever seen: a vast Crusader army, one of the largest Western Europe had ever sent east, was marching through the orchards of the Ghouta, straight for the city. Kings marched with it: the King of France, the King of Germany. The great expedition historians call the Second Crusade had chosen its target. And the target, strangely enough, was a Muslim power that had spent years trading and negotiating with the Crusaders rather than fighting them. For half a century, while Crusader states dug into the coast and Jerusalem, Damascus had played its ancient game. It was never neutral. Exactly. It fought when fighting paid and made truces when truces paid. At times, it even allied with Crusader Jerusalem against rival Muslim princes, because the rulers of Damascus feared their ambitious Muslim neighbors more than they feared the strange knights from the west. It was cold-blooded, sensible, crossroads, politics, the kind this city had practiced since the pharaohs. The Second Crusade ended that world in 4 days. The great army pushed into the orchards and discovered what every invader of Damascus discovers, that the Ghouta fights back. Damascene soldiers and farmers bled the crusaders from behind the garden walls. Every irrigated lane an ambush, every orchard a small fortress with water at its back. Then the Crusader command made a decision historians still shake their heads at. They moved the army out of the orchards, away from the water, to open ground facing the strongest section of wall, dry ground. In July, within days, thirsty, exposed, and quarreling among themselves, the kings abandoned the siege and marched away. The largest crusade of the age dissolved in front of Damascus without ever storming the walls. But something had changed permanently inside the city. Damascus had learned that the old game could no longer protect it. If the Franks would besiege even their own trading partner, then playing all sides was finished. 6 years later, in 1154, the city opened its gates, more or less willingly, to the one man offering a different vision. His name was Nur al-Din, the Turkish ruler of Aleppo, and his vision was simple and revolutionary. Unite the Muslim cities. End the feuding. Face the invaders as one. Nur al-Din is the forgotten giant of this story, overshadowed by the student who surpassed him, pious, austere, and relentlessly organized. He made Damascus his capital and rebuilt it as the engine of a counter-crusade. More colleges, new fortifications, and most famously, a great hospital he endowed in the 1150s, whose elegant carved building still stands in the old city. The hospital served the city's sick for centuries and became a celebrated center of medical teaching, part of the great tradition of the Islamic hospital, and later visitors described its wards and its doctors with admiration. Damascus, under Nur al-Din, became something it had not been since the Umayyads, a capital with a mission, and in his service rose the family that history was waiting for. Kurdish soldiers from the east, a father and an uncle, both commanders, and a quiet nephew named Yusuf, who, according to his own later biographers, preferred religious study to war and had to be pushed into his first great assignment. The assignment was Egypt. Through a chain of campaigns and accidents in the 1160s, the young man ended up master of Cairo. And when his lord Nur al-Din died in 1174, the quiet nephew moved on Damascus and claimed the mission for himself. The world remembers him as Saladin. Let us be clear about him, because the truth makes him more impressive, not less. Saladin was a politician as well as a hero, and he spent more years fighting Muslim rivals to unite Syria and Egypt under his family than he ever spent fighting crusaders. His enemies accused him of hijacking Nur al-Din's cause to build a dynasty, and the accusation was not baseless, but the cause was real to him. And when the great test came, he met it in July of 1187 at a double hill in Galilee called the Horns of Hattin. Saladin's army destroyed the field army of the Crusader kingdom in a single catastrophic day. That October, Jerusalem surrendered to him, and here his legend was made. In a contrast, every chronicler noticed, when the Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in 1099, their own accounts describe a massacre of the city's people. When Saladin took it back, there was no general massacre. The city surrendered on terms. Ransoms were set for the inhabitants and the sources, including Christian ones, describe him releasing many of the poor who could not pay, while his brother ransomed hundreds more from his own purse. It was still a medieval conquest. Those who could not be ransomed faced slavery, and there was grief enough in Jerusalem that autumn, but set against the blood of 1099, the difference was so stark that Europe itself could not stop talking about it. Within a century, European poets were writing Saladin into their own literature as the model of the noble enemy. Dante, who consigned nearly every non-Christian in his poem to punishment, placed Saladin among the virtuous. His great opponent, Richard the Lionheart, King of England, fought him to a standstill in the Third Crusade, never retook Jerusalem, and exchanged courtesies, gifts, and negotiators with him across the battle lines. The two most famous warriors of their age never met face to face. Not once. The legend has never recovered from the disappointment. Between the wars, Damascus was his home, and you could feel the new confidence in its streets. A visitor in Saladin's Damascus might have seen the citadel rising in new strength by the western wall, the college courtyards full, the markets selling to soldiers and pilgrims and merchants from 3 continents. The city that had spent 4 centuries as a province was a capital again, and it knew it. Damascus received his ending too. In 1193, worn out at about 55, Saladin died in the city, and the detail every source repeats is the one that still stuns. The master of Egypt and Syria left almost no personal wealth. The chroniclers say his treasury at death was barely enough to cover his funeral. He had given it away. They buried him in a small chamber beside the Umayyad mosque, and he is still there, a modest dome, a carved wooden cenotaph, a marble one beside it added 7 centuries later with the help of a visiting German emperor. Presidents and kings still visit. The room stays small. His dynasty did not hold together long, as dynasties built on one man rarely do. But the united Syria and Egypt he forged would soon face a test beyond anything the Crusades had brought. Far to the east, in lands most Damascenes could not have named, a nation of horsemen had been welded into the most efficient instrument of conquest the world had yet seen. The Mongols were coming, and the cities that resisted them were not conquered. They were erased. Chapter 9. The Mongol Century and Tamerlane's Fire. In the year 1258, a rider carrying news out of the east would have brought Damascus a story that sounded like the end of the world. Baghdad was gone. Not defeated. Gone. The city of the caliphs. The capital that had eclipsed Damascus 500 years before, had been taken by the Mongols and given over to destruction. The population was slaughtered on a scale the medieval sources describe in numbers historians still debate. The Caliph himself, heir to 5 centuries of caliphs, was executed. Chroniclers wrote that the libraries were emptied into the Tigris, a sentence that is likely part fact and part lament, and that either way told the truth. Something in the old order of the world had broken. 2 years later, in the spring of 1260, the Mongol army under Hulagu crossed the Euphrates. Aleppo resisted and was massacred. Damascus looked at the precedent and made the ancient calculation at the gates. The city surrendered without a fight, and Mongol officers rode through the streets of the city of Saladin. By every pattern of the previous 40 years, Syria was finished. What saved it was an army of slaves. In Cairo, power had been seized by the Mamluks, a caste of elite soldiers purchased as boys from the steppes, mostly Turkish, trained to war from childhood and loyal above all to their own regiments. They were, in effect, cousins of the Mongols, raised on the same horseback warfare, and they were the one army in the region that refused to be paralyzed by the reputation. In September of 1260, at a spring in Galilee called Ain Jalut, the Goliath Spring, the Mamluk army met the Mongol force that had been left in Syria and destroyed it. It was one of the first decisive defeats of a major Mongol force in the region, and its timing made it echo across the world. The Mongol tide, which had seemed like a law of nature, stopped at the edge of the Syrian desert. Syria and Egypt would live. Damascus spent the next century and a half as the second city of the Mamluk Empire, and it was a strange, intense age, brilliant and battered at once. The Mongol threat kept returning. In the year 1300, a Mongol army briefly took the city again, and out of that crisis stepped one of the most consequential and controversial scholars in Islamic history, the Damascene theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, who helped rally the frightened population and rode out to confront the invaders, and whose voluminous writings would be argued over, quoted, and fought about for the next 7 centuries. Yet between the emergencies, Damascus flourished. When the Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta arrived in 1326, near the start of the greatest journey of the Middle Ages, he filled pages with the city's colleges, markets, and charitable endowments, down to a fund, he claimed, for servants who broke their master's dishes, and he recorded the praise that has followed Damascus ever since, that in beauty no city surpassed it. Then came the year 1348, and an enemy no wall could stop. The Black Death entered Damascus, and Ibn Battuta, passing through again, witnessed something he never forgot. As the deaths mounted, he wrote, "The city fasted together and then walked out of the gates together in prayer. Muslims carrying their Quran, Jews carrying their Torah, Christians carrying their gospel, all of them, side by side, asking heaven for deliverance. The plague did not spare Damascus. Plagues spare no one, but that procession, recorded by an eyewitness, may be the truest portrait of this layered city in the entire medieval record. Thousands of years of arrivals, walking together in the dark. The city recovered, as it had always recovered. And then came the catastrophe that Damascenes would measure all other catastrophes against. And it rode under banners from Samarkand. His name was Timur. Europe would remember him as Tamerlane, a Central Asian conqueror who claimed the Mongol inheritance. He built one of history's most feared empires in campaigns that became notorious for deliberate mass killing and for monuments built from the skulls of the dead. His own court histories celebrate these things. They were not accusations. They were advertisements. By the autumn of 1400 he had taken Aleppo, and his army turned south toward Damascus. The Mamluk field army marched north, hesitated, and then withdrew toward Egypt to guard against threats behind it, leaving the second city of the empire to negotiate for itself. What followed produced one of the most extraordinary meetings in the history of ideas. Trapped in Damascus was the greatest historian of the age, Ibn Khaldun, the North African thinker whose theory of how civilizations rise, grow soft, and fall is still read and debated today. In the first weeks of 1401, by his own account, the old scholar was lowered from the city wall by rope to meet the conqueror in his camp. He spent weeks there, conversing with Timur through interpreters about history, geography, and the nature of power, taking notes on the man who was busy proving his theories in fire. His memoir of those conversations survives. It is history interviewing itself. The negotiations brought a surrender on terms. The terms were not kept, whether by plan or by the breakdown that follows, conquering armies into rich cities. In early 1401, Damascus was given over to extortion, plunder, and finally, burning. The chronicles describe fires that consumed whole quarters, and the flames reached the Umayyad mosque itself. Where crowds had taken refuge, the great mosque was gutted, its ceilings and furnishings destroyed, its ancient mosaics scoured, though its walls, as always in this story, refused to fall. It was one of the worst catastrophes in the city's entire recorded history. And then Timur did something that tells you exactly what Damascus meant to the world. He rounded up the city's craftsmen, the swordsmiths, the weavers, the builders, the glassworkers, and marched them east to beautify Samarkand. He did not just take the city's gold. He took its hands. Here we must pause for the legend and set it straight. As promised at the start of this film, Damascus steel. The name refers to blades of watered, patterned steel famous across the medieval world for their strength and edge. And a popular story holds that the secret died in 1401. When Timur took the smiths, the real version is more tangled and more interesting. Modern metallurgical research indicates that the most celebrated blades were forged from ingots of special crucible steel that mostly came from India and Central Asia, worked by heating and forging techniques that faded gradually over later centuries, likely for several reasons, including changes in ore sources and trade routes. Damascus was a great center where such blades were made, finished, traded, and made famous. And Timur's deportation genuinely devastated its workshops. But no single night killed the secret. The truth is less magical than the legend, and it leaves Damascus with a claim no legend is needed to improve. For centuries, when the world wanted to describe the finest steel on earth, the word it reached for was the name of this city. Damascus rebuilt from the ashes one more time, slower now, in a Mamluk Empire itself declining, squeezed by plague after plague, and by something no one at the time could have recognized as a mortal threat. Portuguese ships were learning to sail around Africa, carrying the spice trade out onto the open ocean, far from the caravan roads that had fed this crossroads since the pharaohs. And far to the north, in a city lately renamed Istanbul, an empire of gunpowder, bureaucracy, and ambition had swallowed the last of Byzantium and was turning its attentions south. The Ottomans were coming, and they would stay for 400 years. Chapter 10. 400 Ottoman Years. In August of 1516, on a plain north of Aleppo called Majd-Dabik, two empires met, and only one of them had artillery that mattered. On one side stood the Mamluks, the slave soldier aristocracy that had ruled Syria and Egypt since Ain Jalut, magnificent horsemen fighting the way their grandfathers had fought. On the other side stood the army of the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, drilled infantry and massed cannon, the new mathematics of war. The battle was decided in hours. The elderly Mamluk Sultan died on the field. His army dissolved, and within weeks the Ottomans entered Damascus without a fight. The city, as always, had done the arithmetic at the gates. No one that autumn could have guessed the number that mattered most. The Ottomans would hold Damascus for 402 years, one of the longest continuous stretches of rule by a single dynasty in the city's entire history. Whole family trees grew, branched, and were forgotten while the same sultan's banner flew over the citadel. And the shape those 4 centuries gave the city is, to a remarkable degree, the shape the old city still has today. The Ottomans understood immediately what they had acquired, and it was not primarily a fortress or a tax farm. It was a gateway to heaven. So instead of walking through these 400 years dynasty by dynasty, let us do what this city's calendar did, and organize everything around one single day. The day the Hajj caravan left for Mecca. Picture Damascus on that morning, sometime in the 1700s. We are imagining the scene, but every piece of it is documented in Ottoman records and travelers' accounts. The city has been filling for weeks. Pilgrims from Anatolia, the Balkans, Persia, the Caucasus, thousands upon thousands of them, are lodged in the great merchant inns. The khans, whose stone courtyards and soaring domes still stand in the old city. Every one of those pilgrims needs food. A saddle, aton, a water skin, medicina, rope, and a gift to carry home. And the markets of Damascus exist to sell it all. The smiths are hammering, the provisioners are weighing dates and rice. In the sweet shops, workers are packing the city's specialties, and among them the candied fruit and pastes of the Ghuta's apricots. Orchard sunshine preserved for the desert road, the governor of Damascus, who often carries the proud title of Commander of the Pilgrimage, will ride at the head of the column with his soldiers, because his career, and sometimes his life, depends on bringing the caravan home safely. Somewhere near the head of the procession sways the ceremonial litter that carries the empire's honor. Cannon fire salutes. The column uncoils through the southern gate. A moving city of camels and litters, and begins the 40-day road to Mecca. For 4 centuries, that day was the heartbeat of Damascus. The empire's sultans, who styled themselves protectors of the holy cities, made the Damascus caravan a matter of imperial prestige. And the city built its economy. its architecture, and its year around it. The greatest of the Khans, the Khan of Asad Pasha, finished in the 1750s, is a masterpiece of striped stone and floating domes that travelers have admired for nearly 3 centuries. The Azam family. Local notables who rose in Ottoman service and repeatedly held the governorship in the 1700s. Built beside the markets, the palace that still carries their name. And it teaches the oldest lesson of Damascene architecture. From the street, almost nothing. A wall, a door, then you step through, and there are courtyards of fountains and orange trees. Rooms inlaid like jewel boxes show the street nothing, save the paradise for inside. Around the pilgrimage economy, the wider life of the city thickened. By the 1500s, coffee houses were becoming part of Damascene life, part of the great coffee wave rolling out of Arabia through Cairo and Istanbul, and the city acquired the institution it still runs on, the room where men argue, storytellers perform, and news outruns every courier. On the slopes of Kasiyun, Sultan Selim himself endowed a tomb complex for the mystic Ibn Arabi, who had died in Damascus back in 1240, and the neighborhood around it still carries the saint's name. The city's Christian and Jewish communities lived their generations in their historic quarters. Their legal position was subordinate and separately taxed, but for long stretches they kept their communal institutions, their places of worship, and important roles in the city's trade and crafts. And they built quietly behind their own plain walls, saving their own paradises for inside. It was not all fountains and coffee, and the dark chapter belongs here too. The empire aged. Janissary factions brawled in the streets. Earthquakes and plagues took their tolls. And in 1860, Damascus suffered one of the darkest weeks in its long history, when tensions that had been building across the region, fed by economic upheaval, political change, and sectarian fear, exploded into an attack on the Christian quarter. Over several days, thousands were killed and churches and homes burned. Events documented in Ottoman records and foreign consular reports alike. Out of the horror came one of history's redeeming portraits. The exiled Algerian resistance leader Abd el-Qaeda, then living in Damascus, sheltered large numbers of Christians in his residence and compound. An act of courage honored afterward by governments across Europe and America. The Ottoman state sent a commission, punished officials and perpetrators, and rebuilt the quarter. But reconstruction restored buildings more quickly than it restored trust, and the scar entered the city's long memory as a warning of what happens when the layers of a layered city are turned against each other. By then, the world outside was accelerating past the caravan age. Steamships were eating the desert trade. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, rerouted the commerce of continents around Damascus entirely. Mark Twain passed through in 1867 and found the city ancient, unhurried, and profoundly unimpressed by time. But modernity arrived anyway. The telegraph, new schools, newspapers, a French-built railway to Beirut in 1895, and then, in 1908, the project that captured the whole empire's imagination, the Hejaz Railway. funded partly by Muslim donations from around the world, running steel rails from Damascus south along the old pilgrim road toward Medina. The city of the 40-day caravan became a city where a pilgrim could board a train, and there was one more change, quieter and more dangerous than any locomotive. In the reading rooms and coffee houses, a new idea was circulating in the new Arabic press. The idea that the Arabic-speaking peoples of the empire were a nation, with a history, and perhaps with a future of their own. The Ottoman state noticed, worried, and tightened its grip. Then, in the summer of 1914, Europe went to war, and the empire, after 4 centuries of holding Damascus, made its final wager. It chose a side. Chapter 11. From Empire to Nation. The First World War came to Damascus not as battles, but as hunger, and then as hangings. When the Ottoman Empire entered the war in late 1914 alongside Germany, Syria became a rear base for campaigns against British Egypt, and the war fell on civilians with terrible weight. Military requisitions stripped the markets. An Allied naval blockade strangled imports. And in 1915, a locust plague of biblical scale devoured crops across the region. Famine spread through the Syrian and Lebanese lands, and though historians still refine the numbers, the deaths across the region are counted in the hundreds of thousands. In Damascus, the Ottoman commander Jamal Pasha ruled with an iron hand, and in 1915 and 1916, his courts tried dozens of Arab notables, journalists, and intellectuals for treason, largely on the basis of seized French consular documents. In May of 1916, 21 of them were hanged in the public squares of Damascus and Beirut. The executions divided between the 2 cities on a single morning. Both cities renamed those squares Martyrs' Square, and both still call them that today. The empire believed it was decapitating Arab nationalism. It was writing the movement's founding legend instead. A month later, in the Hejaz, Sharif Hussein of Mecca proclaimed an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, in understanding with Britain, whose wartime promises to him were recorded in a correspondence that diplomats and historians have argued about ever since. His son, the Emir Faisal, led the revolt's northern campaign, raiding the very Hejaz railway the empire had built with such pride. And alongside him rode a young British liaison officer named T.E. Lawrence, whose memoir would make the campaign world famous. Lawrence's own accounts are treated by historians as literature as much as record, and the Arab soldiers who did most of the fighting got far less of the fame. On the 1st of October, 1918, with Ottoman resistance collapsing, Arab and British imperial forces entered Damascus. The scenes of that week filled memoirs for decades. Crowds, gunfire in the air, 4 centuries of Ottoman rule ending in days. Faisal arrived to popular acclaim, and there began one of the briefest and most poignant experiments in the city's history. A modern Arab national government, based in Damascus, building ministries, schools, a currency, and in March of 1920, a Congress that declared Syria an independent kingdom with Faisal as its king. It lasted 4 months. the great powers, meeting at San Remo, had assigned Syria to France as a mandate under the new League of Nations. In keeping with wartime understandings between Britain and France, whose most famous version bears the names Sykes and Picot, France landed troops. And in July of 1920, its army marched on Damascus, at a mountain pass called Maysalun, on the 24th of July. The young Syrian war minister Yusuf al-Azmeh led a badly outnumbered and outgunned force of regulars and volunteers against the French advance. By the accounts that survive him, he went knowing the battle could not be won, and chose to fight it anyway, so that the record would show Syria had not consented. He was killed in the fighting. His statue stands in central Damascus today, and Maysalun became a lasting symbol in Syrian political memory. The name itself shorthand for honorable defeat. The French entered Damascus the next day. Faisal went into exile, and the British later made him king of Iraq, which is a story for another film. The Mandate years were stormy from the start. France divided its Syrian territories into separate statelets, a policy Syrians widely read as divide and rule, and governed with a heavy administrative and military hand. In 1925, grievances ignited in the Druze mountains south of Damascus and spread into a genuinely national uprising, the Great Syrian Revolt, which reached the orchards of the Ghouta and the lanes of the capital itself. In October of that year, responding to rebel activity in the city, French forces shelled Damascus for 2 days, destroying a swath of fine Ottoman-era houses beside the citadel. The ruined quarter was afterward cleared and rebuilt in straight modern lines, and Damascenes named the new district Al-Harika, which means the fire. That is still its name. It is a piece of the city map that functions as a memory. The revolt was suppressed by 1927 at heavy cost, but it had made one thing plain: the mandate could be administered. It would never quite be accepted. What followed was a generation of political struggle rather than open war. Syrian leaders organized, published, boycotted, and negotiated, led by the urban notables of a movement called the National Bloc, many of them Damascenes. A treaty of independence was negotiated in 1936, and then never ratified in Paris. The Second World War brought new occupiers and new promises. Free French and British forces taking Syria from Vichy control in 1941 and declaring independence in principle while keeping power in practice. In May of 1945, with the war in Europe over and Syrian demands pressing, French forces shelled Damascus yet again, striking the Parliament building itself. This time the world's reaction was different. Under British and international pressure, with the new United Nations taking up the question, France agreed to withdraw. On the 17th of April, 1946, the last foreign soldiers departed, and Syrians have celebrated that date as Evacuation Day ever since. The Parliament, whose chamber had been shelled the year before, now sat in a sovereign capital. Stand back and look at what this chapter did to the city's ancient pattern. Because something fundamental had shifted. For thousands of years, Damascus had survived by absorbing its conquerors and outweighting them. In the 20th century, Damascenes had fought, argued, and died not to join someone else's empire on better terms, but to govern themselves. Yusuf al-Azmeh at Maysalun was not making the ancient calculation at the gates. He was refusing it. The city had spent its whole long life learning how to survive history. Now it would have to learn something harder, how to write its own. Chapter 12. The Modern Century. On the 17th of April, 1946, the last French troops left Syrian soil. And for the first time in roughly 2,000 years, since Pompey the Great marched into Syria, Damascus was the capital of a fully independent state. The city that woke up to independence that morning was still in its bones. The old city, the Barada, still came down cold from the mountains. The Umayyad mosque still anchored the maze of markets. But around that ancient core, a modern capital was growing, with ministries and cinemas and boulevards, and a population about to multiply beyond anything in the city's history. Damascus held a few 100,000 people at independence. Within 2 generations, it would hold millions. The first chapter of independence was turbulent, and we can say so plainly because the participants said so themselves. Between 1949 and 1970, Syria experienced a long series of coups and changes of government, a revolving door of colonels and cabinets that became almost proverbial in the region. There was one extraordinary experiment along the way. In 1958, Syria voluntarily merged with Egypt into a single state. The United Arab Republic, dissolving itself into the great wave of Arab nationalism led by the Egyptian president Nasser. Damascus, a capital with a millennium of memories, became a provincial city again, this time by its own choice. The experiment lasted 3 years. In 1961, Syrian officers ended the union, and Damascus resumed its role as a capital. Then came the second movement of the century. In 1963, the Ba'ath Party, a movement built on Arab nationalism and socialism, took power. In 1970, after further struggles inside the regime, the defense minister Hafez al-Assad assumed the leadership. He governed Syria for 30 years, and upon his death in the year 2000, the presidency passed to his son Bashar al-Assad. For over 4 decades under this system, Damascus was the seat of one of the most centralized states in the Middle East, its politics dominated by a single party and family. Stability was real, and so was its price. International human rights organizations documented. Across those decades, severe restrictions on political life and harsh treatment of dissent, including a 1982 military assault on an uprising in the city of Hama, whose death toll, though estimates vary widely, is generally placed in the thousands to tens of thousands. Through those same decades, the city itself transformed. Villages of the Oasis were swallowed into suburbs. Concrete districts climbed the slopes of Mount Kasiyun. Refugees of the region's wars folded into the city's fabric. Palestinians from 1948 onward, and later, after 2003, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, the newest arrivals in the city's ancient tradition of arrival. Modern life pressed hard on the old miracle too. The growing city drank deeply from the Barada and its springs. And in dry years, the golden river of the Greeks ran thin and polluted through the city center, while the orchards of the Ghouta gave ground. Year by year, to concrete. In 1979, the United Nations Cultural Organization, UNESCO, inscribed the old city of Damascus on its list of World Heritage Sites, formally recognizing what this film has argued from its first minute, that this square mile of layered stone belongs to the whole human story. Then came 2011, and the third movement, the hardest to narrate, and this film will narrate it carefully. In the spring of that year, as protest movements spread across the Arab world, demonstrations began in Syria, and the government responded with force. What followed escalated, over months and years, into a war that lasted nearly 14 years, drew in regional and world powers on multiple sides, and became one of the great human catastrophes of the 21st century. The numbers are contested, as wartime numbers always are. But United Nations officials and independent monitoring groups have placed the dead in the hundreds of thousands. The United Nations Refugee Agency registered millions of Syrians as refugees abroad, and millions more were displaced inside the country. Behind each of those numbers was a person, and no film can weigh their griefs against each other. This account cannot adjudicate every disputed claim of that war. What it can do is distinguish between what is alleged, what has been documented, and what remains unresolved, and report the findings of the institutions the world created for exactly this purpose. Damascus lived the war in a particular way. The historic core was never destroyed in the manner of Aleppo's old city or Homs, and the Umayyad mosque came through the war standing, as it has come through everything standing. But the wider city knew mortar, fire, and car bombs, and the suburbs of the Oasis, including parts of the Ghouta, the green miracle from our first chapter, became battlefields and siege zones, where United Nations bodies documented years of blockade, hunger, and bombardment, and the Ghouta's name entered the world's vocabulary for the darkest of reasons. In August of 2013, United Nations inspectors confirmed the large-scale use of the nerve agent sarin against opposition-held suburbs of eastern Ghouta, in an attack that killed hundreds of civilians. Though the inspectors' original mandate did not extend to naming the perpetrator, in later years, joint investigations by the United Nations and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons went further, attributing several other chemical attacks in the war to Syrian government forces, and some attacks using mustard agent to the Islamic State group. Those are the findings on the record, and viewers can read the investigations themselves. Through it all, a generation of Damascene children grew up knowing the sound of shelling in the hills. Families were divided by front lines and by continents, and ordinary Damascenes did what the people of this city have done in every century of this film. Where they could, they kept the markets open, kept the schools running, and kept each other alive. Then, in late 2024, the final collapse of the Assad government arrived with a speed that surprised the world. And the fourth movement of this century began. In November and December of that year, opposition forces launched an offensive from the north, and government defenses gave way in a matter of weeks. On the 8th of December, 2024, President Bashar al-Assad left the country, and the government his family had led for 54 years was over. Opposition forces entered Damascus, and the event most observers had long considered impossible had happened in 11 days. News reporting from those days described crowds in the central squares, prisons thrown open, and, within days, bakeries, markets, and mosques resuming their work as residents tried to restore ordinary life. The Friday prayers that week filled the Umayyad mosque. In the courtyard that has absorbed every change of power since the storm, God's temple stood there. What has followed is a transition whose outcome remains genuinely open, and that must be said plainly. In January of 2025, Ahmed al-Sharaa, leader of the largest opposition faction, was declared transitional president. And in March, a transitional government and a 5-year interim constitutional framework were announced. In October of 2025, an interim parliament was selected, not by direct popular vote, but largely through electoral colleges, with a portion of seats appointed and with some regions not taking part. The record since then, as reported by United Nations bodies and independent researchers, is genuinely mixed, and this account will not simplify it in either direction. There have been steps that international observers welcomed, among them the creation of transitional justice commissions, agreements aimed at integrating the country's remaining armed forces, the lifting or suspension of many international sanctions during 2025 and 2026, and Syria's return to diplomatic engagement with governments around the world. And there have been episodes of serious violence against civilians in several regions, documented by United Nations human rights officials, along with continuing displacement, contested territory, and foreign military operations on Syrian soil. Events in Syria are still unfolding, and this account reflects information available as of the middle of 2026. It is a snapshot, not a verdict. So let this chapter end not with a prediction, but with the one fact 11 chapters have earned. Through the century of coups, the decades of one family's rule, the long war, and the uncertain transition now underway, Damascus never stopped being Damascus. The water still comes down from the mountains. The roads still meet. The apricot orchards of the Ghouta, diminished and wounded, still blossom white every spring, and farmers still bring the fruit into a city that has been buying it for thousands of years. Whatever government sits in Damascus in 10 years, or in 50, that much has survived everything else in this story. Chapter 13. What Damascus Knows. Come back, one last time, to the courtyard where we began. It is early morning at the Umayyad Mosque. The marble of the courtyard is cool underfoot, polished by 13 centuries of footsteps into something that shines like still water. Pigeons lift and wheel against the minarets, along the walls. The surviving golden mosaics catch the first sun, that green and gold dream of paradise. Rivers running through orchards, made by craftsmen 1,300 years ago for a dynasty that has been gone for most of recorded history. Now count the layers beneath your feet, because you know them all. Somewhere far below is the sanctuary of Hadad, the storm god of the Arameans, whose people gave half the ancient world its language. Above that, the stones of Jupiter's temple, whose columns still stand at the market gate a few hundred steps away, with shoppers streaming beneath them. Above that, the memory of the church of John the Baptist, whose shrine still stands inside the prayer hall, honored by everyone who passes it, and around it all, the Mosque of Al-Walid, wonder of its world and of ours, 4 faiths and 40 generations, not piled like rubble, but grown together like the rings of a tree. Not all of those layers were laid peacefully, and this film has not pretended otherwise. They were laid by conquest as often as by consent. The wonder is not that the layers are innocent. The wonder is that they are all still here. In a small chamber against the outer wall lies Saladin, the enemy Europe could not stop admiring, in a tomb that stayed modest because he gave his money away. Out beyond the walls, the lanes of the old city still follow lines that Greek and Roman surveyors drew. And one of those lines is still, after 2,000 years, the street called Straight. Beyond that, the orchards of the Ghouta, wounded by the wars of this century, are being tended again, because the Barada still comes down cold from the mountains, and farmers still know what to do with it. And above everything, bare and patient, stands Mount Kassion, wrapped in its legends, watching its city as it has watched since the first farmers. Now think about every power that has passed through this story. The pharaohs who first wrote the city's name, Assyria, which erased its kingdom, Babylon, Persia, Alexander and his quarreling generals, Rome and Byzantium, the caliphates of Damascus and Baghdad, the Crusaders, the Mongols, Timur, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, the empires of Europe. Every one of them has either vanished from the earth or become something its own rulers would scarcely recognize. The city they fought over outlived them all, and it did not outlive them by being stronger. For most of its history, Damascus survived powers far stronger than itself. It outlived them by being necessary, and by being loved, and by getting up every single morning and opening the shutters. That is what Damascus knows, and it may be the oldest lesson any place on earth can teach. Empires are events. Cities are habits, and the habit of Damascus, the habit of drawing water, planting orchards, welcoming strangers, and building on whatever the last age left behind, has now survived everything history could throw at it, including the parts of history that happened within living memory. To people who are alive today, who lost more than any film can say, and who are still there, keeping the habit, one of the oldest living cities on earth is not a museum. That is the whole point of it. It is somebody's hometown this morning. Children are walking to school past walls that were ancient when Rome was a village. Somewhere in a market lane, someone is arguing about the price of apricots in a doorway that has framed that same argument, in language after language, for generation after generation. The story you have just heard does not have an ending, because its main character declines, politely and permanently, to stop. Thank you for listening. And wherever you find yourself in Damascus, stop for a moment and listen for the sound under the noise. Running water, on its way to an orchard. Its sound is older than every empire in this story. It is still here, and the city, quietly, goes on